Geometries, Alternative Virtual Reality.
So I'm here with Kai Reaver, who is a PhD fellow at the Oslo School of Architecture and Design, if I recall correctly. And yeah, Kai, you have a background as an architect, but have recently started doing a PhD and working with research within cities, smart cities, and sort of the merging of architecture and technology, in which extended reality also comes into place. So I was, just curious to hear about your journey, what your interests are, and how you sort of ended up doing what you're doing now.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Hello, future people on YouTube. So I guess you could say that I was the first generation of architects that was really introduced to 3D modeling, the kind of 3D world from year one. Basically, I started architecture school, and we were given 3D Studio Max, I think, and some of the professors were big into the kind of digital shift in architecture. So that was my introduction, really, to making kind of fully, photorealistic renderings and stuff as the kind of first test group of students to do that. And then I guess another kind of component was traveling around with really old architecture professors to like Rome and Greece and looking at the kind of history of architecture being, thousands of years old, and kind of looking at those two ways, this kind of 3D world we're looking at, this very old world with some of the most amazing geometries you can think of, and just kind of experiencing that and trying to figure out what it would mean to be an architect in this kind of context. The second thing was, a lot of architecture school is about so-called kind of immersing oneself within culture and politics and trying to figure out where society is going. Architecture spans from sort of understanding the history of architecture and then trying to predict where society should go and to design a kind of built environment based on, that when you build something, it should stand hopefully forever, right? So you kind of look 500 years back into the past, and you look, 500 years into the future, and it makes the digital shift that we're within today very important. I think architects really need to be looking at what's happening with digitization, not only from a kind of a view of practice, what an architect should be, how an architect can be working, but also what does that mean for society, and as a kind of political standpoint, should we be doing this at all, and if we are, for who?
Yeah.
And then at a philosophical standpoint, architects have been dealing with the sort of hard problem of consciousness for a couple thousand years now, where it's this relationship between mind and body, and the so-called kind of dualist argument is something that's been a part of just understanding what is reality, what is kind of inserting a human environment into reality all about. And so there obviously there are a lot of really interesting philosophical questions that arise from a kind of mixed reality environment, and also it creates a very fertile testing ground for doing experiments, for doing academic research that is based on kind of real world case studies. So there's kind of a great span going on there, and we're definitely in the middle of it, especially inside of this platform, right? Is this is this real, and how do we begin to talk about it as architects? I think is important.
Yeah, it's very interesting. There is a lot of philosophy of technology which probably has some parallels to that, right? How are we to view the things that we create? And there is, of course, an overlap there. So, for instance, our technology or architecture, it is some sort of expression of humanity that is inserted into reality, like you said. And how do you view this in terms of what can architecture tell about us, and how can it affect us? What role do you think that architecture has in our lives?
Yeah, well, so one of the good things about architecture is it's super old. So we have a lot of kind of foundational documents that we have to read through. the first real kind of document that I can find about architecture in the sort of Western canon is Aristotle, who's talking about Hippodamus, who was the first both city planner and the first political philosopher. And so what the Greeks were doing, 500 years before the birth of Christ, is they were designing kind of prototypical city-states, if you will, to try to figure out how to kind of model a society. And so they did all these different prototypes. And one of the things that Hippodamus did was, one of his experiments was a prototypical city for 10,000 inhabitants. And one of the kind of main design questions was, how do you allow for people to kind of exist together as 10,000 people in this kind of city-state? And so he invented this system of zoning of private, public, and religious space.
Yeah.
So it's like you had private space, which is obviously the home, where you had a kind of legal system where you could kind of do whatever you want. I mean, if you were a Greek citizen, which is only 1 out of 9 people, you had kind of total, totalitarian authority over the private home, and that was the kind of invention of what we would call private law. Then you had public space, which was like the streets, and more importantly, the agora, which was this very big public space that was designed to house everybody in the city, right? 10,000 people.
Yeah.
And that's where you got these words. It was called the agora, and it developed 2 new words, agorazo and agora-oe, which is to speak in public and to shop, or to go to the market. And then you had religious space, right, which was the temples devoted to the gods and these sorts of things. So I think, if foundationally within a kind of understanding of city planning and political philosophy and architecture, we have this idea that the human subject needs to be able to kind of have 3 different modes of subjectivity, if you will. Right. Our kind of private life, our public life, and our spiritual life, if you will. And I think, when you exit your building, your house in the morning, I think there is a kind of shift, right? I think people
for sure
experience, I'm entering publicness, right?
Yes.
And so I think, that's a kind of foundational thing that really keeps society kind of together. And I would argue that, when we've digitized a lot of space and we've brought technology into environments, I think we really fragmented that, right? And so I think that's the kind of base discussion to be having is, what's the relationship between a kind of political, legal system of how we move between different areas or zones, if you will, and how does that become reflected in the kind of environment that we inhabit, and what's going on with technology. I think, one of the main problems we have with technology today is not the platform, kind of the idea of having new platforms. I think it's that these platforms have kind of mismanaged the relationship between private and public space primarily. And I think we have a lot of kind of discussions to be had. And I think architecture has been quite good at keeping those roles kind of articulated, and kind of we've been building kind of institutions based on that kind of foundational understanding. So I hope that, I think there's a lot that architecture could contribute to this discussion, but I think that we as architects also have to be much better at explaining what we do, why we do what we do,
right?
Why we've been doing it, and why, how this could be relevant to some sort of discussion of technology.
Yeah, I really like what you're saying about when you're walking out your front door. There definitely is a different mood. For me, it's more. More stimulating. You're going out of one subjectivity into another for sure. And I think also with these worlds that we are having, here in VR chat, right? There is a lot of potential that is yet unexplored in terms of maybe there are different modes as well than these 3. I think that those are probably very foundational, and I think most people can relate to them. That you have this public, private, and also perhaps, like you said, religious, or some sort of more transcendent space that is, I'm not sure, but what kind of rooms and places people can create for themselves is also something that I find very interesting in terms of like mind palaces, or if you could have different
definitely.
rooms for different activities. So I don't know if have you thought about like the role of fictional spaces and what kind of moods they can set you in, or maybe provide room for different activities, or yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think that's one of the things that got me into the whole VR thing was, you know, what can architecture actually create in forms of, let's say, subjectivity?
Yeah.
And I think one thing that that you do as an architect, I spent 4 or 5 years working for one of the world's kind of most famous architecture studios all around the world, and I was teaching architecture studios with a lot of really good architects, and one of the things we did was we traveled around the world and we visited, you know, temples and palaces and some of the most, you know, amazing places that humans have created. You know, we have there are temples in Kyoto which are just, you know, absolutely mind-blowing in terms of the, you know, kind of spiritual quality, or just the ability to place the mind within an environment that that can, you know, create thoughts that would perhaps be difficult to create had one not been in that type of environment, to put it that way. You also have religious spaces or even political spaces like the Alhambra in Granada in Andalusia of Spain, where that was kind of the capital of the Islamic kingdom in the south of Spain, where, you know, you just have like geometry, kind of fractal geometry articulated to.
They're so crazy, those. Yeah, it's amazing.
And so these spaces, when you visit these spaces and you take them as a kind of at a comparative level, right? You don't, even if you disregard the context and you just kind of experience them as kind of raw experience, you're definitely being put into something that is allowing the human subject to go somewhere. And I think it's actually allowing one to go somewhere internally. And I think you can relate this to kind of, you know, maybe Buddhist philosophy or meditation and consciousness studies. I think you can relate it to, you know, the kind of neuroscience of experience, and of course the kind of neuroscience of the first person, right? The kind of understanding merely the kind of what consciousness is and what conscious experience can be. And then if you look at, you know, I think what's important is those experiences, just like you said, are collective, right? When you enter like a temple in Kyoto, you can be a group of several people and you can share an experience together. And I think this is really something that, you know, could potentially be explored in VR, is that we have the ability, and that's been part of my work, is we have the ability to not only create kind of any space we want in VR, but we also have the ability to completely kind of back up or make a copy of real world spaces, which is something that I've been spending a lot of time on through 3D scanning and sound copying. So maybe we like just want to make some of these spaces available for the general public at like a mass level. That to me seems like a kind of good start.
Yes. Yeah, because many of these places, they are disappearing, and it's difficult to keep them in the same condition. And yeah, having a backup, like you say, I mean, we need to keep. I mean, this is of course like cultural heritage, right? Which has been virtual technologies have been used a lot for. And I remember we were talking briefly, probably a few months ago, regarding this, because I was wondering on your perspective on something you had shared, and that some big actors are doing this, but that's not necessarily the solution to what we want. So what was your thought about that? That we need to be able to do this ourselves, not relying on these big giants like Google to sort of own this data or the culture, or I can't remember exactly what it was, but you had an interesting perspective there.
Yeah. So, you know, obviously with climate change, we're losing a lot of cultural heritage sites all around the world, and a lot of them are along the equator, where, you know, sea level rise and erosion are going to be big problems, and the kind of dual problem that happens there is then migration, right? So the caretakers of these sites are you know, local inhabitants often, and with you know, just the kind of mass change that will happen to the environment, I think unfortunately we're going to have to look at the possibility of losing, a vast amount of human cultural heritage, unfortunately. And so I'm teaching a course now. I'm actually going to Switzerland tomorrow, where I teach 2 courses. One is called Architectural Heritage and Digital Media.
All right, cool.
And the other is a kind of experimental virtual reality as a kind of interface to future workplaces. So like, automated automated bulldozers in Germany being run by people at home in whatever.
Yeah.
In Brazil. But anyways, so the at least the architectural heritage and digital media component is if we have to accept that we're going to lose a huge amount of cultural heritage, should we be, busy making a kind of backup of everything? And if we're going to do that, we have to do some pretty good testing on if the resolution is going to be good enough.
Yes.
And like what kind of formats, what kind of curating, what kind of venues will we then be bringing people into? So it's not only the kind of backup, but it's also the recreation of those things as kind of virtual replicas. And how do we do that? Who should do that? What would be the best way to bring, a class of school children to, a temple in Indonesia? Right? How would we do that? And I think, the most important thing is that the people that own these sites and who understand the curation today and tell that story, they have to be involved, right? If we have this kind of mass recolonization of all human culture,
right?
One, we're going to misunderstand it. Secondly, we're going to contextualize everything through the medium. Third, the ownership rights of those digital files will kind of replace the ownership rights of physical property. Yeah. So I think that's also where we have this kind of weird zoning problem where we haven't really figured out who owns the data when it's related to a physical site. Other than that, whoever makes the data gets a kind of fresh ownership rights. So I think, that's one of the things that concerns me about private companies doing a huge amount of cultural heritage, is that they kind of own the file. Yeah. And when that is the only real thing that exists anymore, if you lose a site, for example, or if it deteriorates, we're going to have to, in some future scenario where we can 3D print everything. Yeah. The 3D printing of, the Indonesian temple is going to be owned, it's going to have like a Google advertisement or something like that. And I think we have to we need a more robust, framework for how to start discussing these things, I believe.
Yeah, and it's also good that you mentioned, the quality, because before this grand project capturing absolutely everything occurs, what technologies are good enough, what resolution are we talking about, and just in general, because photos aren't enough. Like you said, being in certain environments, you get this this feeling or this state that you couldn't attain otherwise. But just capturing random photos of things so that you know how it looks, it would be nice if you were able to capture it as it is experienced, and that probably requires a lot of work, testing and figuring out which solutions are even work. But what are your thoughts on what is the best way? Is this something that is going to happen in like 100 years, do you think, or?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think it matters when it happens. Like, I think that's one of the problems we have with contemporary society, is that it's so short-term planned.
Yeah.
The reason why we can go to Paris today the reason why we can really the reason why we go anywhere today and have some sort of, interesting experience is because people were planning after their own lifetimes,
Yeah.
Good cities take hundreds of years. So I think that's one of the main problems, and when we have a kind of methodology of technology coming from Silicon Valley called "move fast and break things." I think that's kind of antithetical to what architects and city planners and kind of people that are concerned with the built environment have as a methodology. I think our methodology is more think carefully and move slowly. And so we're definitely trying to play catch up with what the digital sector has been doing, and I think in a way we kind of have to fight for the right. Like, I see a lot of IT companies hiring software engineers that get to call themselves architects, and I, obviously it's a big concern for me that that in a 40-year time span, basically since 1980, we've kind of removed any idea of public architecture or public planning. So that's going back to talking about the physical world, but we don't really have city architects and city planners anymore. We have private companies that kind of make these decisions by themselves. So I don't really see a public institution that could kind of take on this in a holistic manner, unless you look at maybe things like UNESCO or other kind of global world heritage organizations and these sorts of things. But so I think that's one thing. Another thing is that I started a kind of small research company just to be looking at how could the public sector be doing research into these kind of things as it would be applied to their day-to-day work. And so I've been working a lot with kind of various actors within the planning and building agency here in Oslo, with like working with user groups. So I just came back from working with youth between 14 and 16, where we're using an augmented reality interface to plan the planting of 100,000 trees within Oslo before 2030.
Yeah, nice.
And so it's like, I think what we need to kind of be doing is to understanding how these technologies could be implemented within kind of the existing regulatory structure that we have in society, and the institutions that are meant to be kind of handling those types of projects. And specifically, like, the built environment is based on several kind of democratic procedures, right? You can't just build a house. You have to send in a permit, you have to make drawings. And I know people like think that bureaucracy is like boring and slow and stuff, but there's also a reason. Like, I don't think anybody wants their neighbor to just build a skyscraper next to their house without asking you. Yeah. So Shoshana Zuboff, the business professor at Harvard, she just wrote a book called Surveillance Capitalism, and one of the great quotes she had was from the two Google executives who in 2013 they wrote a book called The New Digital Age. I think it was Eric Schmidt and I can't remember the other name, but they wrote that the internet is the largest experiment in anarchy, and it's not truly bound by physical laws. Yeah. And I feel like that's a great quote. That's probably the problem. It's like, as these technologies become more physical, more a component of the built environment, it's like they're going to have to at some point have a relationship to the physical reality and to the legal structure that is, the zoning, if you will, going back to Hippopotamus, that those legal codes of Western society have been based upon. So it's like, if you want to put something into the physical world, you have to make an application and a permit, and you have to use an architect. So this is why architects care about this, is because we're the people that usually represent clients when they want to put something into the real world.
Yeah.
And so then you have to write, even if it's just an advertisement, right? If you want to put up like an advertising screen on the facade of a building, you have to apply for that, and then somebody with an education in those matters will evaluate it on behalf of the public, and they'll make a decision. And so I think when I see a lot of these let's say proposals by big tech companies about putting these this digital environment, this kind of minority report environment, into the physical world, I'm like, is this just going to be a kind of filter bubble thing? Are we going to move into like everybody's in their own filter bubble, or are we actually talking about a kind of public shared environment that everybody's going to be inhabiting? And who's going to be processing the applications for this to happen, right? So I think it's like, it might be great. Like, it could be great to have some sort of digital information stream of, here's the bus is going to come here in 12 seconds, it's going to park here, this is where you enter the bus. That kind of interface could be super valuable, but it's like, who's going to design it, and who's going to apply that into the physical world through what legal code? I think it's like we have to kind of figure out what the kind of procedural components of how to implement digital information into physical space. Like, what institutions do we already have? How can we use them? And can we just like use the already existing frameworks that we have on behalf of a kind of democratic society, or in theory at least, can we use those? And can we use those in the implementation of this kind of digital smart city, whatever you want to call it?
Yeah, it's a great question, because on the one hand, you could say, well, it's just an application, right? It's just something I downloaded at my augmented reality headset, and it just uses the environment to trigger certain things. So it's rougher, because you don't have that one environment called the Earth. You're just using the Earth to instantiate all these other overlays or whatever. So who is owning this, and will it be an anarchy as with the internet? The internet has been amazing because of this lack of anonymity in some regards, but in other ways it hasn't. I mean, first of all, when the internet started, I mean, we would have done it so much better if we just knew what was going on before the thing exploded. I mean, in terms of meta information and just having a semantic web. Instead, the result was that Google and Facebook and everyone who sort of made a business out of actually organizing the information became the giants and sort of those owning the internet. So I'm thinking the same thing in terms of like the metaverse. Who is going to own the metaverse? And I think there is a big fight going on right now. I mean, in terms of Oculus, just released their Quest 2, which is really, really cheap. That is, of course, an investment, because if all these people are going into Oculus and Facebook reality is sort of the new metaverse reality, then them owning this metaverse and being able to make those decisions, it may be possible that they then are the owners of this new public space. I don't know if you have any thoughts on, not necessarily the specific actors here, but this fight, or who is going to own it?
Oh yeah. I mean, of course, and definitely everything you're saying is the question. Well, yeah. That's the political question, and the point here is, I think Mark Zuckerberg wanted 1 billion users inside of VR.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, we've of course done experiments with private streets and other like private infrastructure. And that's one of the dominant trends that we've seen in urban development the past 30, 40 years, is that there's been an increasing privatization of public space. So there's a lot of, we know how this works at a city planning level. And we know through like testing all the various different ways in which this can work, is that you kind of have to have public ownership of critical infrastructure. Otherwise it doesn't really work.
Yeah.
And so you have to be able to allow people to protest and organize in the streets and in public space. Otherwise, the public discussion kind of breaks down. And so I think we know that infrastructure that is reliant upon a kind of public discourse, it needs to be publicly owned, and the institutions of that have to kind of exist for that to function. Of course, I know we've all experimented with the kind of private community, right? We know about gated communities that have privatized infrastructure, but the problem with gated communities is that you have to have a certain level of membership, right? And that's your access to the space, if you will. And the problem that creates is, of course, this isn't a public space. This is based on a specific ownership user level, and I think you can't really have a real public discussion or a real kind of public discourse within a privatized space. I think it's quite difficult, just because there will always be some sort of legal code that could dictate the possibilities of what can happen. So if you're in a let's say you're in a gated community, a private space, which this kind of digital metaverse could turn out to be.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, you can have rules about what you can wear, right?
Yeah.
Like, or what you can do. You can have rules about there's a curfew at 8 o'clock, whatever. There can be all kinds of new rules that can be instantiated within private law. And so I think that's why it's so important that we keep the internet, the kind of internet that I grew up with, the kind of 90s internet. It needs to continue to be publicly owned. And if we're going to have this kind of mixed reality interface or interfaces, these kind of various bubbles that we can exist within, I think it's okay if people are allowed to, let's say, create their own world within these things, but I think the baseline infrastructure needs to be a public infrastructure that can articulate a legal code that allows kind of multiple destinations to unfold. It's like when you load in VR chat There's already, you're entering a private space and it tells you, you know, what you're allowed to do, what you're like we aren't allowed to conduct quote unquote hate speech, right? Like I don't even know what that is.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
I can assume I know what it is, but you know, it's like, okay, are they taking a code from public space and trying to implement it into private space, or are we just like inventing a legal code of what this new metaverse is going to be like? So again, I think like public institutions need to be quite involved here, and this is why, you know, I try to work with like either state or municipal institutions that already do this every day, like the planning and building agency and the planning departments and the heritage groups and these sorts of things. It's like they're already doing this and they already know how to do it. It's just that we haven't fully understood what that means in terms of a kind of digital, you know, what you call a metaverse or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
I think we need like the institutions that are going to keep that public. And I think the track record of Silicon Valley companies is like super low right now on actually creating public assets.
Yeah.
So I think that's the problem. That's the problem, but it's also the opportunity. It's like, I'm so happy that these books about surveillance capitalism or the social dilemma, all these kind of things where we see, okay, social media companies have been portraying themselves as public space.
Yeah.
But they actually are not accepting the responsibility of doing so. They're like, they don't want to be a media company because then they have to have, you know, an editorial board. And then they say, so we have to already say that, okay, we know before we instantiate this VR metaverse that it's not working, even at the level of like news on a screen scrolling down in front of your face. Like it doesn't even work at the screen level right now, and that's so obvious.
Yeah.
That gives us the reason to say, okay, well, let's like take a step back before we bring 6 billion people into the Oculus ecosystem, right?
Right.
And so, you know, we're at a very critical point in human history right now, but it's also amazing that we, in this beta phase that we're in now of like digitization, that all of these problems are so blatantly displaying themselves in front of us. And that's good.
Yeah,
it's like great that we can actually see what's happening. And I think a lot of these companies and a lot of the people, the employees of these companies, are super interested in like not creating all of these problems. I think they're looking at like, you know, how do we get rid of the fake news problem? How do we, you know, but I think the real difficulty that all of this comes from is this kind of, let's say, there's a text from I think 1994 called The Californian Ideology, where it's talking about how this kind of tech environment that's growing out of California has a kind of weird mix of like libertarianism, kind of Ayn Rand objectivism, laissez-faire capitalism, and like basically every single component of political ideology that does not believe in a public sector, right? So it's like all of the worst ingredients of the left and the right put together to create this like we don't like government kind of idea. And I think that's the wrong way to look at it. It's like, if you don't think the government is operating in an optimal manner, it's like, go into government and fix it. And I think it's that easy, but it's of course, when you're like a 20-year-old kid in, you know, college, it's a lot more interesting to kind of enter a tech startup and make millions of dollars than it is to like try to reform a slightly dysfunctional political system.
Yeah.
But I see among my students, and I see among the kind of groups that, you know, people that call me or want to do an interview or something, I'm meeting a new generation of young humans now who are interested in entering politics, entering bureaucratic, democratic institutions and trying to fix them. And so I think, you know, that's really where the kind of legitimacy of the welfare state, if you will, is going to be. It's like, how do we actually digitize the welfare state in competition with these private actors that are turning more and more into their own kind of proto states?
Yeah.
And maybe there's a merging there, but I'm not sure how that's going to work yet.
No, and I mean, in that case, it's good if that people are doing this, because I mean, I don't want to be too pessimistic, but public, like, computer systems don't usually sort of win. I mean, in terms of obtaining the users, and that's a shame, because it is a race, or feels like a race in certain respects. And when we do already have these giant actors placed, like Facebook investing in Oculus, and now the distinction is even harder to make between the two. But I'm thinking a lot of the problems as well from having these digital spaces is that you can't sort of just blame reality itself, or if there are problems in the sort of real world, of course there could be made changes as well. But when you have this platform, and the platform is structured in a particular way, and the problems are going to result from the way that it is structured. And of course fake news is a big problem, and they are afraid to go out to censor people because that would sort of threaten the democracy even more. And it's a real yeah, it's a pickle. I mean, in terms of how it should be organized, and it's just so rough. It's so big, and that's the problem. These companies are so big. These spaces are so big. They are regulating people's lives in an extreme manner, and having one company behind this, basically you can have one person making a decision that is going to affect millions of people, and that is of course the problem, and what the public could do better, that it would be based on democracy, people could vote, what are the rules going to be in this public metaverse thing, instead of people want you to not go to bed so you can see more ads. I mean, that is sort of what we're seeing with people trying to maximize screen time on their applications. And it's a hard problem.
Yeah, it is a hard problem. I think, one thing that makes me super optimistic actually is that, like, when I look at the campus designs of like Apple and Google and stuff, it's like terrible. Like the architecture is really bad. So I mean, it's like so apparent that they don't know what they're doing, and I think that's really comforting for me to see that, when they choose architects, they choose the old guard architects that weren't even around when this was, that haven't really been participating in this whole digital discussion, like right. at a nominal level. So what will make me really terrified is when Google and Facebook start hiring my students. Right. Then I'm gonna run for the hills, because right now they hire people that don't know anything about this, and it's because the engineers at these companies don't see the connections that we're talking about, right? And so it's like, I'm so happy that they don't, because that means that we still have time, and we still have the intellectual capacity to be relevant in this discussion. It's like, I've talked to Google a couple times, and when talking with them, it's like there's definitely a huge curiosity for all of this stuff. And they increasingly have architects coming over and kind of doing lectures and things like this about the built environment. And I think what we have to do is we have to say, we have to have the highest moral priority here has to be human well-being. Yes. That's where we stack this. We have to have human well-being at the top. It's like we could be in a simulation. We could be brains in the Matrix. It's like we have no idea, actually. The only thing we know is that we have human consciousness, and that we can experience a world, and that can make us feel either better or worse. Right. And it's like, okay, we have to put human well-being at the top, and then we have to make a hierarchy of values from that top. And so if we can actually structure that and begin kind of rigorous studies of, again, these types of medias allow us to do rigorous studies of, predictive evaluation of how the built environment will influence humans. And when we can do that at a physical level, we can also do that at a digital level, right? So if we can just start there, okay, let's say Google already has terrible architecture, and we just say, okay, we want to do this metaverse. Let's start with an evaluation of how humans experience space, either physically or digitally. It doesn't matter. I don't care. Let's just assume that those two things are going to be the same thing within the next 10,000 years. And let's also assume that we have 3D printers that are that are able to print at like a molecular level, whatever. Let's just like take those two things and then work, a 10,000 year trajectory. Those are the two base technologies of this metaverse, and let's just work like down the hierarchy of values from there. And I think we just have to kind of start structuring that argument. And I think we already have a lot of the science to do so. Like last week, I was in a conference for it's called the Academy for Neuroscience and Architecture, and it's neuroscientists in La Jolla and with architects just talking about, what can we do with MRI? What can we do with virtual reality? What can we do with psychology? And so we can start to really construct a kind of rigorous scientific inquiry into all of these questions, and we can build it from there. Well, when we can take all the evidence from, okay, let's say the beta testing of the metaverse when everything was on a screen in front of your face before it became, contact lenses or virtual reality goggles or whatever the interfacing is going to be. We now have plenty of evidence of what this first version interface, this kind of very crude screen in front of us, what kind of problems that can create.
Right.
So I think we already let's take the evidence, let's build up a kind of rigorous. So that, I think, again, I don't think we already exist in some sort of dystopia. I think we have a kind of very fertile breeding ground to start to really have this discussion, and the sooner we can get both public and private actors together to talk about this, I think the better. And so my job, I guess, is to figure out how to educate young people to participate in that discussion, and to kind of do the starting experiments of how to conduct that form of research when building a new form of, let's say, spatially oriented technology practice. So sorry, hello, disconnection. But yeah, I think that we have we have a huge body of evidence with, the political situation going on in the West. We have the ability with these tools to make very sophisticated experiments, with virtual reality,
yes,
fMRI, all these sorts of things. And of course, with 3D modeling software, the price of graphics cards, like we can do incredibly sophisticated, digital simulations of things and very sophisticated experiments. I think now's the kind of time to really invest in doing so, and to start a kind of totally open inquiry into what this would mean, who should own it, who should design it, and that we do that instead of merely kind of this move fast and break things mentality of kind of carpet bombing society with new technology. It's like, instead of doing that, maybe we should sit down and do what I think architects have been good at, is plan. Like, we need planning. We need to be planning technology based on the democratic institutions we already have. We should be planning through those institutions, and then based on that, we should create a 10,000-year plan for how we want to build.
Your sound fell out briefly.
Oh, okay. Well,
yeah.
Hopefully people understood what happened.
Yeah, it's back now. But yeah, I enjoy that perspective. I mean, doing a good job, thinking of this seriously, taking this as a serious project that may require time, real research, and yeah, making a plan of how we are basically going to live our lives with these new technologies. That would be ideal. Absolutely, and like you said, there are good, some good prospects in terms of the technology that we have available now for doing this, and VR, of course, being a part of this rigorous testing. Yeah, I like that. I'm also wondering a bit what you're lying in these terms of smart cities and urbanism, which I know is one of your interests. Could you elaborate a bit on that and what it means to you?
Yeah, sure. So, I guess the smart city is the concept where this really turns into built environment policy. Like, I don't know, there are thousands of smart city projects around the world.
Yeah.
And they're being discussed and built as we speak. And all it really is the term that everybody was able to agree upon. It's like this integration of tech with cities. And of course, within the next 30 years, what is it? The majority of the human population will be within an urban environment. And with population growth and urbanization, I think we're going to see that whatever's going on in cities in relation to technology is going to be the forefront of where we see this implementation. And some of the the main points are like how to fix mobility, how to deal with kind of critical infrastructure and these sorts of things. And it's a discourse that's largely been created by tech companies. It's like IBM and Cisco and these big companies after the financial crisis, they had to find a way to kind of implement a lot of their patented technology, sensors and network technology, all kinds of things. And they saw that municipal city governments were like really big potential clients, right?
Yeah.
And so you see so many digitization projects that are a component of city planning now, and they're kind of, and so this is where you really see a political, let's say, consensus that the term smart city, it's like nobody wants to be a dumb city. So so
Right.
every politician has sort of agreed that okay, our city is going to be a smart city, and it's going to be smarter than the other cities. And then they pass budgets based on this idea. And then after they do all that, they call somebody like me and they go, oh my God, we have this 10-year smart city plan. We have no idea what a smart city is. And then I go, okay, well, maybe we should have a discussion about what that would mean. And so this is where I really see all of this happening, is at the intersection of city planning, real estate development, and let's say mobility and urban services, et cetera, et cetera. And then more importantly, I think right now during the COVID-19 pandemic, you really see it at the intersection of security, surveillance, population control, and these sorts of things, and specifically the relationship between emergency services and mobile data. So right now I'm in Oslo, Norway, where they have a system called Trio, Safe in Oslo, where it's basically a collaboration between the emergency services department and the two main telecom operators, where they have a partnership deal where they're basically transferring mobile data in real time, and to generate a kind of real-time map of users in the city. And then with a bit of a lag, I think maybe 3 days, they have a one-to-one at like a numerical level of 1. So like 58,381 users went between this city district and this city district on this day. So it's very, very accurate. And part of my research recently has been to see what is this kind of security apparatus in relation to COVID-19 telling us about the future of the smart city, if you will. And so basically at an infrastructural level, especially with things like 5G, we're going to have incredibly precise positioning in physical space in urban environments. And yeah, that can be very useful. And so I'm teaching a course right now about the future of urban services within a 5G network. And basically what the hypothesis is that you will have millimeter precision between smart objects and the urban environment, and that with that you can directly connect any object to the zoning plan of the city.
Yeah.
So as you draw a digital map of where things in the city go, you can also designate a kind of relationship to that to the urban services, be it transportation or food delivery or repair or any other kind of thing. And we got a list actually from the Oslo municipality of 6 areas that they're looking at digitizing. And I think it's mobility, food, reparation, like repairing things, recycling, exchanging, and one last one. I can't remember. But we're looking at like kind of all of those sectors as a kind of extension of the public sector. But also with private actors, of course, we see a lot of really interesting new services popping up within this kind of digital metaverse. And we're just trying to look at how do we kind of put the boxes together and organize things into kind of coherent systems of physical and digital regulation and services. And then the students are being asked to kind of prototype a type of service.
That's nice.
Either an entire system, like how does an autonomous car function within a city that takes control, for example? Like there's an emergency services plan for getting everybody out of the city, where I think it's like all the autonomous vehicles just aren't allowed to drive on the streets. It's only buses and things. So it's like, okay, how would that actually function as a security protocol to like get the entire network to function as one transportation system? And what would the kind of collective understanding of mobility be within a kind of distributed, smart, if you will, network? So again, I think it's like the smart city is where this discussion is really practical at the level of policy, because these projects are being done now, and because you have a urban planning framework that's based on like procedural rights, participation from users, voting, competitions. Like there's all these kind of standardized procedures that are a component of urban planning. It's a really good place to both be prototyping technology, because you're doing it within a kind of jurisdictional legal framework where you're kind of designing something for a specific reason, and it's also kind of, let's say, it's testing things within this kind of democratic structure of how procedures are supposed to be implemented.
Yeah, that's important.
And so I think it's just like this smart city kind of testing ground allows this discussion to happen at multiple levels. And because the things are happening in real time with actual budgets, actual clients, actual infrastructure, and actual, neighbors, actual citizens, it's all kind of happening at once. So it's a little bit out of the kind of social media world and kind of into a kind of real world context where a lot of things are happening, but also nobody really knows what's happening. And so you have this kind of research territory where the ground is there, the money is sort of there, the political will is there, and then everybody's kind of asking each other questions and trying to figure out what this thing actually means. So it's a good space to be doing research, but it's also super challenging because everybody is trying to do it right now. It's like this kind of this curve, this kind of timeline is like at the level of city planning, which is kind of happening in real time.
Yeah.
So it's very difficult to have a discussion about what the long-term consequences of any of this will be, because we're moving so quickly. It's like whatever was happening 3 months ago is irrelevant.
Yeah, I can only imagine. I mean, also in terms of the consequences, there are so many ethical dilemmas with a lot of the things that you've brought up, which is also interesting and good for your students, that they are designing these services and sort of being engaged in imagining these future societies and how it will be organized at the... I mean, I can't help but think about Cyberpunk 2077, which I'm I'm looking forward to coming out. I wonder how the environments will be and how they will function in terms of these smart cities. And this was a really fun conversation. Yeah, thanks a lot. I hope you people on the other end of the blue dot that's filming, I hope this is interesting for you. I hope the technical component of this worked out. A really, really interesting discussion to have, and I hope it can continue. And I hope also whatever feedback people have on the whatever the infrastructure is. I guess it's the YouTube comment field. And if you have any integrated into this discussion. If you have any, if people want to contact you with some ideas, if you want contact or whatever, I don't know if you operate on some Twitter stuff. You have your website with the project. Do you have any links you want to drop? Or no, I think definitely just drop an email if people are interested. Kai@reaver.info is probably the best. And then, I think the more of these sorts of things that will be happening, hopefully the less I will have to be talking. Like it'd be great if this turned into like a collective discussion where we could be 30 or 40 people in here having a kind of like a kind of board meeting about the future of digitization, right? So I hope the next time I see any of you, will be in a larger public format where we're making a kind of policy discussion based on these issues being not merely a kind of niche interest, but we're really talking about the kind of future of society here. Yeah. So hopefully, in the next iteration, we'll be in a large forum where also people can interact and have their comments and hopefully, voice their opinion. Because again, I'm just kind of ballparking what I think people are talking about or are concerned about. Yeah. But we really don't know. It's like we have to integrate this discussion into some sort of democracy. Like
as quickly as possible.
Yeah,
but
it's
for
true.
now, you know, proto democracy in the YouTube comment field will be
yeah.
your chance to voice your opinion.
Yeah, come with your best concerns and best hopes for the future in the comments. That would do. That would be something. All right. Thanks, Kai. It was nice having you.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.